Welcome everyone to this World Press Freedom Day discussion with two of the most accomplished journalists of our time. Marty Baron, the former executive editor of the Washington Post, and David Shribman, the former executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and a nationally syndicated columnist. I'm Greg Victor, the founder of the International Free Expression Project. We're an independent nonprofit organization. It started about 5 years ago in the United States city of Pittsburgh. Our mission is to make noise in defense of free expression. And that means we want to deploy our own initiatives and those of allied organizations in dramatic ways that capture public attention, with the idea being we want to galvanize people to work for a world in which people can be who they are and say what they want and be heard. A good example of our collaborative approach is our partnership with IFEX, which is the global network of more than 100 free expression organizations. Together, we have installed a 140-foot long art installation on the facade of the historic Pittsburgh Press and Post-Gazette building in downtown Pittsburgh. The exhibit, which is opening today, is called Faces of Free Expression, and it features the faces and stories of people who have worked to advance the cause of free expression, often at grave risk. The exhibition on the building runs through June 14th, so if you happen to be in Pittsburgh or live in Pittsburgh, please go downtown and check it out. Since today is our inaugural virtual event, please allow me to briefly tell you a little bit more about the International Free Expression Project. What we want to do is, one, hold an international competition to design a work of public art symbolizing free expression that can be programmed and reprogrammed from anywhere in the world to appear as almost anything. It can be the work of art from a Brazilian artist to the story of a journalist who was murdered in Russia. Two, we want to build a marketplace of ideas in a vast abandoned press room at the front entrance to the city of Pittsburgh. This marketplace would be an ever-changing mix of educational activities, art, performance, discussion, food and drink. Our third initiative is to invent immersive educational tools that can be used by teachers and advocacy groups around the world. And our fourth initiative is to support artists by commissioning and exhibiting their work. Every one of these ambitious initiatives is well on its way, which is a bit of a surprise to me as to how far they've gotten. But for more information, please go to ifep.io. Press freedom is under attack now more than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Authoritarianism is on the rise everywhere. And the first thing would-be dictators try to do is to seize power is to silence independent journalists so nobody will know about their crimes or misdeeds. Russia, Hungary, the Philippines, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, the list of governments killing, jailing, beating, hounding, and otherwise persecuting journalists is long and it's growing. In different form, the tide has swept onto our shores here in the United States as well. News outlets that do their best to observe a traditional code of journalistic ethics, such as check facts, be fair, correct mistakes, separate news from opinion, expose wrongdoing. These outlets are being accused of spreading fake news and are being called enemies of the people. The aim is to discredit real news and overwhelm it with mis and disinformation for political purposes. Fortunately, we have Marty Baron and David Shribman here today, who are going to tell us how to fix this mess. Let me tell you a little about them. Marty Baron retired in February as executive editor of the Washington Post. after a 45-year career leading some of the most consequential newspapers in the country. During his 8-year tenure at the Post, the paper won 10 Pulitzer Prizes and had to work its way through multiple crises, including the assassination of Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi at the hands of the Saudi government. Marty Baron also is a member of the International Free Expression Project's International Advisory Board, for which we are most grateful. David Shriman is a scholar in residence at Carnegie Mellon University and a professor of American politics at McGill University in Montreal. He has been awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one as a national reporter and columnist in 1995, when he was the Washington bureau chief for the Boston Globe, and one as executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for its staff coverage of the 2018 mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue here in Pittsburgh. And with that, I'll hand things over to David Shribman.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you all of you for checking in here. I want to start, Marty, with the question that's on all Americans' minds: is, are you going to play the lead role in the docudrama of the life of Liev Schreiber?
Absolutely. I'm sure he would love that. Yes.
No. Why don't you talk for a second?
It will get the audience that it deserves.
Yes. Well, why don't you talk for just a moment about what it was like to be portrayed by him and whether you think he did a good job?
Yeah, I think he did a good job. I think he captured me. At least a lot of people say so.
The Boston priests abused kids in 6 different parishes over the last 30 years. The church found out about it and did nothing.
This is bigger than Boston. This is the whole system.
Spotlight team, show me that it came from the top down.
My closest friends say that I actually do have a sense of humor, which wasn't evident from that movie. But, I was very happy with the movie because I think it highlighted the importance of investigative journalism. It showed what it takes to what's required in order to do it properly, why it's necessary, the impact that it can have. I think it reminded, frankly, a lot of journalists, both whether editors and publishers and owners, of the necessity of investing in investigative journalism, that was central to our mission of holding power to account. And then I think finally, it reminded all of us that it's really important to listen to people without power because they can have very powerful things to say. And it's really important that we give people a fair hearing, listen to people generously and empathetically. And if there is evidence of wrongdoing, we as institutions, journalistic institutions, have an absolute obligation to pursue that. And it's interesting that I often get asked about the church and whether I was concerned about the power of the church in New England, which at the time I think was the most powerful institution around. It is not today, but was then. And my answer is that the more powerful the institution, the greater the obligation we have to pursue wrongdoing. And the more powerless the victims of wrongdoing, really the greater the urgency we have to listen to them and to pursue what they have to say.
We're talking, of course, about the movie Spotlight. And Marty, were there elements in that movie or elements omitted from that movie about some of the internal pressures you may have felt on Morrissey Boulevard in Boston from the church or from people who affiliated or loved the church, or even from those who had skepticism about the church?
Internally, I don't think so. I mean, I think that it captured some of the concerns initially. I think there was a feeling that the Globe had previously, as recently as I believe it was in 1992, that there had been an investigation of a Father Porter in Fall River, Massachusetts. There had been tremendous blowback from the church as a result of that. The Cardinal Law, the same Cardinal we had when I arrived, he called down the power of God on the Boston Globe, and so there was a lot of pushback from that. And ultimately, the Globe was not able to document more than the wrongdoing of Father Porter himself. And so I think there was a feeling that maybe we'd already done this story, but we had not done the story. As far as the church was concerned, their pushback was primarily in court. We went to court to get documents that were under seal, that were covered by a confidentiality order. Those were the internal documents of the church that would reveal the truth in terms of how it actually handled credible allegations of sexual abuse by clergy. Fortunately, we were successful in getting that, but the church had actually put up a vigorous fight in the court. And at one point, it actually went to court threatening to seek sanctions of us, even if we went to interview priests about the cases in which they were involved, which was really an extraordinary effort to sort of infringe on our freedom to engage in journalism. So, but there were no, I wouldn't say that there were overt threats. You know, there was a woman who was a Harvard professor, Marianne Glendon, who later became ambassador to the Vatican, who subsequently said that if we won a Pulitzer Prize for the work that we did, and we were still doing the investigation, she said if we won a Pulitzer Prize, it would be like giving the Nobel Peace Prize to Osama bin Laden. And then there was the cardinal in Honduras, who was at the time a candidate, presumed a candidate to be the next pope. And he basically attributed all these investigations to Jews in the media. It was maybe only a coincidence that I was a Jew in the media, but but you know, that was the nature of I think the pressure. One was pressure of the internal feeling by some that perhaps we'd done this story, and then there was the external pressure from the church itself.
I should add, Marty, that for an airing of the movie, I invited Pittsburgh's Bishop David Zubik to the movie, and he thought it was quite splendid, actually. So
Yeah.
There were some moments sitting with him that I wondered what he thought, but nonetheless, he was quite generous.
Yeah, and I have to say that, I mean, I think the most gratifying reaction that I've gotten, some of the most gratifying reaction beyond the survivors of abuse, was from Catholics and Catholic priests who felt that it was necessary, that it needed to be done, that it was overdue. And that's been incredibly gratifying to hear that from them.
Marty, we have shared moments of journalists under attack. One when we were both at the Boston Globe, but you went through a searing experience with the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Do you want to talk about how you first heard about that and your reaction as time went through?
Yeah, well, I had not met him because he worked in the opinion department. And I think there were a lot of people in the opinion department who hadn't met him because he was a contributing opinion writer. And it was just, he wasn't a regular opinion writer for the Post. And like regular in the sense of twice a week or once a week or something like that. But he contribute with some regularity, but not on that frequency. So I hadn't met him, but I mean, I think that it was just a shock to everybody in the newsroom because you expect that journalists, particularly, we know that journalists around the world are under threat. Journalists have been assassinated, they've been kidnapped, their families have been threatened, all of that. They're pressured in a variety of ways, so through their companies, what have you. Owners are pressured, but you don't expect that journalists who work for American news organizations are somehow going to be assassinated, dismembered, their body disposed of, and we have no idea where. That there would be some protection that comes with being resident in the United States, which Khashoggi was. He was a legal U.S. resident, and affiliated with the Washington Post. So I think it sent home the message that any journalist could be under threat, and that the previous administration in the United States was not going to do very much to protect American journalists, and also that other countries felt empowered and liberated in a way to do whatever they wished with journalists, whether they worked for American news organizations or not.
You know, as we are taping this, Marty, I noticed that 3 members of the editorial page staff of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette are listening in now, and their ears probably perked up, as did mine, when you said, I think, the most important sentence, perhaps of this entire day, when you said that you hadn't met Khashoggi because he was an opinion writer. And that gets to the very important distinction between those who produce the news and those who are involved with the editorial page and opinion. And do you want to talk about the separation? You and I always call it the separation of church and state, or the Chinese wall, but I think it's much misunderstood. And I think it's a vital element of the questions we're going to examine later about whether we're all prejudiced or biased or have agendas, etc.
Yeah, well, as in the United States, at least, it's been a long tradition. It's not universal, but there's been a long tradition of a separation between the news department and the opinion department. That's been the case at every newspaper I've ever worked at. So it was true in Miami, it was true in LA, it was true in New York, it was true in Boston, it was true in Washington, that we operated with complete independence from the opinion department, and the opinion department operated with complete independence from us. There are, now, of course, I know quite a few people in the opinion department. We all work in the same building and we interact in one fashion or another. It's not like we can't say good morning to each other, but whether we don't see each other on social occasions. But we don't, I don't take any instructions from people who are in the opinion department, and they don't take any instructions from me. And I don't see the editorials until they come out. Nor the opinion columns until they come out. I agree with some, I disagree with some. It's really irrelevant, and I don't weigh in whatsoever on what it is they have to write. And I'm very restrained in expressing my own opinions about virtually any subject other than the subject that we're talking about here today, which is a free and independent press and free expression generally.
So when people throw around the notion that we're biased or that we have agendas, and that we are enemies of the people and are, all big Democrats or liberals or whatever it is. I mean, I know I don't ever speak anywhere where the first question isn't, what about fake news? I always say that in my entire career, I've never been witness to or participated in one story, one paragraph, one sentence, one word, or one syllable that was knowingly put in the newspaper that was false. Isn't that the way we all operate, Marty?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think obviously we make mistakes because we're human. All humans make mistakes, and that's the nature of every profession. And we're not exempt from that. But I've never been associated with any instance where someone has deliberately disseminated something that was false. That's just never happened. I mean, look, at the Washington Post right now, they have about 1,000 journalists in their newsroom. Quite honestly, you wouldn't need 1,000 journalists if you were out there just making stuff up. I mean, why incur the expense? Well, the reason that a place like the Post incurs that expense, or any newsroom incurs the expense of having so many reporters, is so that they can do reporting, that they can get out in the world, they can get out in the universe outside of their own, outside of the office and outside of their own life, to tell the world what's really happening. And many of these reporters, of course, do this at great risk to themselves, whether it's in covering violence here in the United States of one sort or another, but also going to conflict zones in other parts of the world. One of the saddest moments for me was having to announce that our colleague, Elizabeth Newfer at the Boston Globe, had been killed while reporting on Iraq. And we always worry about that. And you and I also had shared a friendship with Anthony Shadid, who was killed while he was working in Syria. He was reporting from Syria. He died while reporting from Syria. And he was working for the New York Times at that point, but he had previously worked for the Globe, and he had previously worked for the Washington Post, and was a good friend of many people, and many people in our profession, and just an extraordinary journalist and human being. And people don't take those kinds of risks in order to make stuff up. They take those kinds of risks because they think it's really important that the public know what is happening in our communities, in our country, and in our world.
When Anthony Shadid, who was working with me at the Washington Bureau of the Globe, and with you and as editor of the Globe, he had 2 episodes. He was actually shot in Israel, and I believe you flew to Israel to see him. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was shot during one of the intifadas. He was shot in Ramallah, and I flew to Israel and went to the Hadassah Hospital, one of the Hadassah hospitals in Jerusalem, to see him. He came very close to suffering a severe injury. I mean, the bullet came I would say within a half an inch, a quarter an inch of hitting a spot that could have paralyzed him. As it was, he lost a fair amount of mobility in one of his arms, and but it was, I mean, it was extraordinary. And then he went back and he went back to covering conflict zones and found himself detained in Libya at another stage of his career, and then ultimately died while covering. He was based in Lebanon with his family, but he was covering Syria and died.
One of the most searing memories I have was picking him up at the airport after coming back from his injury. So, Marty, how do journalists react to being described as enemies of the people?
It's hard to generalize about journalists. We're not all the same. I think that for me, I can speak to about myself. I mean, that was the moment where I realized that there were no limits to what Donald Trump would do in terms of attacking journalists and journalism itself, and that he would go. There were no limits, no boundaries whatsoever. It was deeply offensive. I can handle sort of criticizing us if he wants to call us, as he did, scum and garbage and all that sort of stuff. That's one thing. But when you talk about enemies of the people, that's the language that authoritarians have used over the years. And it signaled to me that he was moving into a territory that was extremely dangerous and that really posed a threat to American journalists, because if we were viewed as enemies of the people, or as he actually called us later, traitors, and that we had committed treason and what have you, then you were basically telling people that we should be targeted in some fashion or another. And there was no doubt in my mind that at some point, journalists would be targeted not only for harassment online, but for physical attack as well.
Were there some episodes of people at the Post who had threats to their lives?
Oh yeah, constantly. Yeah, there were. Me too. I mean, so we had to really ramp up security as we had never done before, not just for our office, but for individual journalists as well.
Right. Well, that phrase "enemy of the people" comes from Stalin, and of course, he's responsible probably for the death of as many as 30 million people. So it was a very jarring and searing and terrifying, really, epithet to throw around. To what extent did democracy dies in darkness grow out of that? Which I should explain is the kind of the motto of the Washington Post, kind of the equivalent of all the news that's fit to print.
Yeah, we thought it was more up to date because there's no, all the news that's fit to print. On the internet you can print as much as you want. So, and there's almost certainly a lot more that's fit to print than they have printed on a piece of paper. So, in any event, it didn't have anything to do with it. Frankly, Jeff Bezos, who became our owner in 2013, he wanted to have a motto that captured the essence of our distinct mission at the Washington Post, being in the nation's capital, and with a paper that had a history going back to Watergate that was very much defined. Its identity with the American public was very much defined by its coverage of Watergate. And so we didn't have a motto really. And so he thought we should come up with something. And so we embarked on that. And frankly, there was I don't think a clear understanding among people at the Post as to what exactly he was looking for. Although, he did say he wanted something that, people would be willing to put on a T-shirt, and it would be part of a cause that they would be identified. They would want to be a part of, like a member of a club. And so, but it started well before Donald Trump won the presidency, when people were still thinking that he wouldn't win the presidency. It just turned out that we finally settled on something just prior to his being elected, and then it took some time to implement. So there was an assumption that, the often mistaken assumption that correlation is the same as causation, that Trump's election was the reason for it, but it wasn't. It was not the reason for it.
So, Marty, we were both born in 1954, although you are always swift to point out that I'm 7 months older. Yeah. But we came into the business as young guys with certain kinds of values and certain kinds of approaches to our craft. Fact-checking, fairness overall, ethics, these all evolved as we were young journalists and as we did our craft, are these the values of today's journalism and today's young journalists?
I hope so. I think they should be. I think those are the principles that we had at the Post. I think it's important that institutions like the Post enforce those standards and insist upon them. And in fact, we do require it of everybody. I keep talking in the present tense. It's only been since February 28th that I've been gone. So it'll take some time to adjust. But I mean, we tell people what our standards are when they come on board, and by coming on board, coming onto the payroll, they agree to those standards. And so I think it's important that we enforce those standards. I do worry about people expressing their feelings on social media, particularly on Twitter. I think that those things have caused problems for us in the past. They do suggest to the public that there's an agenda beyond independently, open-mindedly, fairly, accurately, honestly, and honorably getting the facts, putting them in context, and then telling people what we've learned. This does not mean that we shouldn't be, fairness does not mean that we should somehow obscure what we've learned, that it's sort of both sidesism, as it's been called, or neutrality or balance or whatever it is, that no matter what we report, that maybe that'll only represent 50% of what we report, and then we'll quote other people saying something that's completely contradictory. That's not what fairness is. Fairness means that you go into a story with with an open mind, a willingness to listen, a determination to rigorously report the facts, to try to put things into context as best you can, and then to tell people what you've determined to be the truth as best you can ascertain it. And so that's what we ought to be doing. And I think that we should. It's very important that we embody those standards in everything that we do.
Well, we were rising college juniors when Richard Nixon resigned, and he told some whoppers. But the New York Times and Washington Post and Boston Globe and Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and others never used the word liar or lie in the course of reporting about the president, about 37th president. Talk about the evolution of that and how your views on that and how the word liar or lie tended to become fairly unremarkable in the course of writing about President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning we were very reluctant to use that word because a lot of people would just focus on the language we were using as opposed to the facts of the matter. What was important to us is that these things were false and that we should tell people they were false. And also, in order to say lie, we needed to feel confident that he, in fact, knew that what he was saying was not true. And a lot of times, you got the sense that Donald Trump was sort of living in a life of was self-deluded, really, that he was convincing himself that things were true when, in fact, they were not. And if we didn't have evidence to the contrary, we were just reluctant to use the word that suggested that this was that these falsehoods were deliberate on his part, and maybe just out of a feeling that giving him essentially every benefit of the doubt. But at some point, the number of lies really added up. I mean, this was by the time he ended his administration, there were 30,000 plus falsehoods of one sort or another, outright lies, falsehoods, misleading statements, things like that, according to the calculations of the fact checker of the Washington Post, which stayed on top of this amazingly throughout 4 years of his administration and during his campaigns.
Marty, your paper makes money. Our former paper, the Globe, makes money, but very few big city newspapers make money today. Up in Canada, I'm a dual citizen, as you know. Up in Canada, the Canadian government is thinking about and actually implementing some sorts of government supplements and subventions for mainstream media. Does that trouble you, or does that please you, or comfort you, or distress you?
Well, I'm not in favor of subsidies from the federal government or any government for the press. I think that if we're going to make an argument that we're truly independent, then we shouldn't be dependent on the government for our very survival. One can only imagine how a government would use that leverage in order to influence what we publish. If they can make or break us, they will they will try to do so at some point. I've never seen a government have a power that it doesn't ultimately exercise. And if you just look back at the previous administration, if we had subsidies from the government in the previous administration, if they had threatened to withdraw them, one can only imagine what the consequences of that might be. And I don't have any doubt that the previous administration would have threatened to do something of that sort.
So Marty, quite apart from kind of the gilded situation you were in Washington, what should the rest of us do to make sure that we can continue to do our work and pay our employees and our colleagues and not run up multi tens of millions of dollars of losses? A lot of Los Angeles Times publicly has said it's lost $50 million in the last year. That's real money. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to go forward? I've got some ideas, but I'd like to hear yours.
Well, I hope you sell them. Look, I don't have all the answers. First of all, I would quibble a bit with the premise that we have that at the Post we had a gilded situation. The reality is that Jeff Bezos didn't run the Washington Post like a charity. I'm very glad he didn't, because his objective was to create a sustainable business model. Because if he ran like a charity and someday he retired of the charity, we would have been stuck without a sustainable business model.
Fair enough.
Whatsoever. So, I mean, he did invest at the beginning, but the Post has been profitable now for about a half dozen years. So, and we have had the opportunity to invest our earnings back into the operations, because obviously Jeff Bezos doesn't need the dividends. So, but I think, there's a lesson there, and that is that, each of these, and I think every media outlet needs to come up with its own strategy. I don't know that there's one answer for any of them. I do think that it's really important that local news organizations charge for what they do, but in exchange for charging, they have to offer something that provides real value. That's the exchange. That's the agreement. The public has to pay, and we have to offer them something worth paying for. In the old days, when there were print newspapers sitting in a box or that people bought over the counter, we didn't give it away for free. The only ones that did were except sort of some weekly publications and things like that. So we charged people for it, and we didn't charge enough, but we charged. And I think that we have to send a signal that if you want quality news, you're going to have to pay for it. But we need to provide quality news too. And what's happening a lot in this profession and this business is that newsrooms are being stripped down to a degree that they can scarcely cover their communities. And nobody's going to pay for that if they can't do their jobs. So, we also have to understand that we live in a digital era. That's the way people get news. We have to be able to provide news in a way that is suitable for the way people live their lives. And mostly that means they're going to get news on a mobile phone. And so we need to figure that out and not pretend that, the old way is the good way and it's the way that we want it to be. We need to rapidly adjust. But we need to charge, whether it's whether it's in print or whether it's on a digital device. People need to pay for it.
So Marty, when you go to your 65th reunion at Lehigh, will any of your classmates be walking around with a print newspaper?
Well, keep in mind that's quite a couple of decades off my 65th reunion. So thankfully.
Well, it's not that far, yeah.
In any event, no, I don't think they will. I don't think they will, and hardly any would do so today, frankly. If you look at college campuses today and newspapers are dropped off at these places, typically the physical newspapers aren't even picked up. People are reading them on their digital devices. That's just the way people live. So do I think a physical newspaper is going to survive? Well, maybe there'll be a weekly, maybe there'll be magazines, there'll be things like that. But if you look at circulation trends for newspapers in this country, they're all in the decline. And the same is true in other countries as well. They all have the same concerns. Talk to papers in Europe, talk to papers in Latin America, talk to papers in Asia. They're all seeing the same trends. It's obvious. We live in a digital world.
12 years ago, we visited our daughter in college. She's the daughter of two journalists, and there was a huge pile of New York Timeses right beside where we were having breakfast. And I asked Elizabeth Shribman if she ever picked one up, and she looked at me as if she wondered why she would pick up, some kind of a poisonous snake. And that was 12 years ago. So
Right.
why is the Post even publishing or printing today?
Well, I'm sure if there had been a pile of Pittsburgh Post Gazettes there or the Washington Post,
of course, that would be different.
Nonetheless, we print because people want to buy it, because there are people of a certain generation who want to read in print, and they're willing to pay for it. They pay good money, and we make money off of it, both from the subscriptions as well as the advertising that appears. So, but at some point, it's probably not going to be economic. I don't know exactly when that's going to be. But I think since you gave me the timeline of about 20 years, a little less than 20 years, but about 20 years, then I would say that it's probably going to be uneconomic well before then.
Yeah, I think that's so. Are you worried about the quality of news that people ingest today, where they get it?
Oh yeah, I'm enormously worried about it. I mean, I think that people they don't even know where they're getting news these days. They're looking on the internet, they're seeing stuff. They don't even know what the origin of that news is. They don't know who's behind that organization, if there is even an organization. They may not even know the identity of the individual who wrote that, if it was even written by that person or just copied and pasted from some other site. They have no idea. And I think the level of news literacy is exceptionally low. And people are inclined to believe what reinforces their pre-existing point of view. And so they're drawn to sites that will do that. And so I am concerned about the quality of the news that people are absorbing. And I don't think it's getting better. I think it's getting worse.
So what are we to do about that? I mean, we grew up with the notion that you should read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times or the Boston Globe. I don't think young people today have that notion. They don't reach, or not only young people, anybody, reach to be challenged in their views, to read. If you're a reader of liberal things, you don't read the Wall Street Journal editorial page. If you're partial to those views, you're not reading the New Yorker or some other things. What is to be done in that regard?
Well, I think
it's not really our job, of course, but it's consequential for us.
I was about to say that. I mean, I think that the job of misinformation and disinformation is a societal problem, not just one for the press to solve. But obviously, it has a huge consequence for us. I mean, I do think that certainly during the Trump administration, there were many young people who became readers, frankly, of traditional news organizations in the way that they hadn't been before, because they saw that, places like the Washington Post and the New York Times and others were doing really good accountability journalism, holding power to account. And many young people began to appreciate traditional journalism in a way that they simply had not before. And so now how do you get those people to continue reading traditional publications if we write things that offend them in some way or that contradict their pre-existing point of view? I think that's a big question. And how do you get them to read opinions that contradict them or that contrasting opinions? Look, I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think that that's a societal issue, and I think that look, we had a lot of people at the Post. I didn't get involved in the opinion side, but whenever there was an op-ed columnist who wrote something that offended people on the left, I would still receive a lot of emails because people thought I was in charge of that. And they were going to cancel because so-and-so said something that was supportive of Donald Trump. And it's kind of amazing to me that people would do that, but that is in fact their reaction.
I don't think many of our viewers today will appreciate the great transformation in a part of the business that we're not, you and I are not directly involved in, or we're not. But the difference between the funding or the economics of in newspapers that used to be funded primarily by advertising with a little bit by subscriptions, and now it's basically reversed. Do you want to explain that to our readers?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to that a little bit earlier, and that is that, in the past we did charge people for the paper, but it was really very low price. It was 25 cents or 50 cents. That only
I remember when I worked at the Salem News and they increased the price from 10 cents to 12 cents. My father told me it wasn't worth the extra 2 cents.
Yeah, well, you're dating yourself there, David. You're 8 months older than I am, so I don't remember that. But in any event, people. So it was very little. It was a small portion of what paid for our costs. Advertising paid for the cost of the newsroom. But look, advertising has diminished. It's all been sucked up by the big tech platforms, Facebook and Google in particular. Amazon as well, by the way. So, but others also, and because they can target in a more efficient way. So, and the classified advertising obviously has gone away. So all of these lucrative sources of income for newspapers have disappeared. And so we've now had to sort of turn to our subscribers and say, look, you need to pay us what it's really worth. You were never paying what it was really worth. Our initial instinct in this profession was to charge nothing on the internet because we were afraid that our competitors would dominate the internet if we charged anything. And so people got accustomed to thinking that this was that information should be free. As they put it, information wanted to be free. Well, of course, information doesn't have wishes, but we now need to train people that to tell them that that was just a mistake. That it does cost money, that reporters expect to be paid, they should be paid. And if you want quality information, you'll have to pay. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. So now we're much more dependent. Many news organizations now have at least 50% of their revenue attributable to subscriptions as opposed to advertising.
Yeah. And you and I could go on forever, and I don't know if Greg Victor wants to interrupt us or stop us, but if we want to go on forever, here's another question I would ask you. If the young Marty Baron, or its equivalent, should there be one, came to you and said, well, should I go into journalism today? It doesn't seem to pay anything. You get attacked. It's nobody respects you. What your predecessor, Matt Storin, used to say about being an editor, that friends come and go, but enemies accumulate. It's a great phrase. It's lived experience for the two of us. I mean, why should any smart person go and waste their lives doing this kind of silly work?
Well, I don't consider it a waste of life. I think the work that we do is essential to a democracy. I think it's really important that people have the information they need and deserve to know as citizens, and in order to be engaged with this democracy. So I think it's really noble. I think it's really noble work. The arguments that you just provided for not going into the field are kind of the same arguments that existed when I went into it. My mother said, don't you want to be a lawyer like all your friends? I wasn't being paid very much. It didn't have the stature of being a lawyer, all that sort of stuff. But I think that any young person who wants to go into it and has a passion for it and is likely to be good at it should go into it. I think journalism is going to continue to exist. There's going to be, as long as we have a democracy, we have a need for the press to tell people what's happening in their communities and in their country and around the world. And it's invigorating to be part of that. I mean, and to have the opportunity to be a learner for your entire life, which is what a journalist ought to be. We should do a lot less telling and a lot more listening, and we have this opportunity to learn what we didn't know and communicate that to the public. That's a really exciting opportunity for anybody, and it's also necessary for our society. So I would encourage anybody who has a passion for it to go into it. We'll figure out our problems over time.
Well, Marty, my parents were apoplectic too when I decided to go into this field, but it's been the most exhilarating experience that anybody can have. It's been a wonderful experience. It's a chance to really to learn, try to understand your times, to understand what makes the world work, and to realize your own fallibility. Because every time you sit down at the typewriter, or I date myself again, don't I? Every time you sit down at the keyboard and try to convey to someone else, to many people, what you have seen and learned, you realize how hard it is and how difficult it is to get it just right. So
you do it better. You do it better than almost anyone, David. So,
well, thank you.
Fallible
But
as you are, there are a lot of others who are much more fallible than you are. So
it's darn hard work. Greg, I see that you have something to add here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, you asked the question, do I want to cut you off? And the answer is no. But I don't know that you guys want to, talk for another hour or two. And Daria does have some questions collected. So if we could run through some of those for, 15, 20 minutes, are you ready?
Yep.
We're ready, but eventually we have to have lunch too. So go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have some questions that people have sent me through the direct messaging, but if you have any others, speaking to the audience members, that you want me to ask, you can just send them to me right now, and I will add them to my list. So I wanted to start out by asking, to begin with, Marty Baron, a question for you, which is basically just, now that you are, 3 months into retirement, what does it mean to you? And what do you have planned for next?
Yeah, I'm not 3 months into it. I'm like 5 weeks into it. So, so I'm still figuring that out. I would like to be a voice for journalism, to speak up for journalism and its importance to society as a whole. I'd like to be a voice for the standards that I believe in. We talked about that a bit already, and to make clear why I think those standards are important, and to do what I can to make sure that they are very much a part of our profession. So I'm looking for ways to do that. I have, a variety of options, thankfully, and I'm considering those at the moment.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask David Shriman the same question, not about retirement, but just basically what is ahead for you and what plans you have.
Well, I've been semi-retired for about 27 months. I still write my column that's syndicated nationally. I write a separate one for the Globe and Mail in Canada. I teach at McGill. I have a chair, kind of a office, not a chair, at, the office has a chair, but I don't have an endowed chair at Carnegie Mellon, which is about 3/4 of a mile from my house. And so I'm trying to keep engaged and to be an evangelist for the values that Marty has so well expressed. I think this is a time for evangelism from all of us who believe devoutly in this cause. I'm glad Marty used the word cause, in this cause and this craft. And it's been a lot of fun, and I don't really miss being in the newsroom, and I bet you don't either, Marty. And we can both take comfort from what Bill Keller, who was an editor of the New York Times, said about some of the things you have to do when you're editor. When he left the editorship of the New York Times, he said, I'm happy to stop making believe I care about some things I don't care about. And that's a good thing. And those are mostly things that are peripheral to putting out the newspaper. So I'm glad about that. And I'm glad that there are people who have taken the reins of journalism and who believe in it as deeply as Marty and I do.
Thank you for those answers. So I also wanted to ask, sort of hearkening back to something that you guys spoke about, just in terms of the exceptionalism of this past year or so, in terms of the former president's relationship with the media and social media, as well as obviously the pandemic. And I wanted to ask, basically, how do you think journalism will move forward in the coming years? Is there a sort of normal that it will return to, or do you see any new trends for the coming years and more.
You want to go first, Marty?
Sure. I mean, I don't know what normal is anymore, frankly. So, I mean, I think the nature of the way that we distribute news was going to change. The storytelling formats are definitely going to change. They already have. At the Post, we were already investing heavily in what we called visual journalism, greater use of all the tools that are now available to us. You know, whether it's video or audio or animation or annotation or interactive graphics or you name it, all of that in an integrated way that works on a mobile device. So I think just the very nature of storytelling is going to change. It's not going to be a traditional text-based approach because we're a much more visual society. You know, at the bigger level, our relationship, the overall sort of condition of the business. I mean, I think this was written about by Ben Smith in the New York Times column today, you know, with the development of Substack, Ghost, things like that. There is capacity for journalists to go off on their own and be independent operators. We'll see. I'll have to wait and see how that really develops, whether that can sustain itself. The latest fashion in our business doesn't always last for very long. So I think there's a possibility of that. In terms of a relationship with administrations, you know, I think we're likely to see perhaps a more ideological tilt in the profession overall. I hope that's not true of the mainstream news organizations. I don't want that to be true. I want them to be truly independent and be activists only for getting at the truth. That's the only activism that I am interested in. Get the facts, put them in context, tell them to people, give people the information they need and deserve to know in the most compelling way possible. But I do think that there is a tendency in the profession overall to move much more back to the way that things were practiced in the early days of the country, which was basically ideological pamphleteering. And we're seeing a lot of that now. I think that'll represent a significant change in the profession.
You know, about 20 years ago, my older daughter, Elizabeth, was in the 5th grade, and there was a bus trip to the Statue of Liberty, and the two chaperones were me, Marty, I think I probably snuck out of work that day, I didn't tell you, and John Herbers, whose grandson was in that class. And John Herbers, Marty will remember, was one of the distinguished White House correspondents for the New York Times, and he had covered Nixon. And the two of us were sitting in the back of the bus paying too little attention to the 5th graders. And I was complaining, moaning that, you know, oh, John, you had Nixon and Watergate, and what do we have? We have end welfare, as you know it, and the Clinton stimulus. And within a few minutes, actually within a few hours or days, we had the Lewinsky episode and the second impeachment of a president. And so I don't know that, as Marty says, there is any normal. In fact, I think Marty would agree that if things were normal, we'd have nothing to put in the paper. That the definition of news is the departure from the normal. So I don't really crave a time of normality. That's a phrase that Warren Harding, normalcy, he made up that word. It didn't really exist. So I'm kind of looking for more abnormality. It makes our jobs and lives more interesting. People used to say that humankind's happiest days were written on the blank pages of history, which is to say times when nothing happened. But boy, we'd be out of work if we lived on the blank pages of history and the blank pages of newspapers. So bring it on.
We'll never have to worry about that.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like we have time only for one more question. And we've been getting a lot of questions about just disinformation in general. And I wanted to hear you guys talk about basically how can what you might consider real journalism overcome the onslaught of extreme trolling, misinformation, disinformation, and all of that.
Well,
Well, go ahead, David, you have the
Well,
answer.
in economics, there's Gresham's law is that bad money chases out the good. We can't afford for there to be a Gresham's law of journalism when bad information chases out the good. We have bet our lives, many fortunes, and sacred honor on the notion that good news, which isn't to say happy news, but well-produced news will eventually prevail. And I think that is that devout faith and devout conviction in that, and the prosecution of that by our colleagues or our former colleagues is the best medicine.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that look, I don't have the answers to this, to tell you the truth. And as I indicated before, I think it's a broader societal problem. But I think there are some things that we can try to do and do better. One is I think that we need to explain a little bit more about who we are. There's these incredible caricature stereotypes of who journalists are. All elitists supposedly live on the coast, what have you. Total nonsense. Number two is that I think we just need to provide more transparency about how we go about our work and what's the basis for what we said. So if there are documents to show the documents, annotate them in a way, point people to the passage that we've shown. If there's a video, if there's an audio, if there's anything that can help people, that helps people see that these things are rooted in actual fact, then we need to provide it. We need to provide it to them on the internet because we can, and they can look at it themselves. And then third, I think that we just need to do a better job of getting out into the country and into our communities and talking to everybody, and so that they feel that they are really represented accurately, honorably. They may not agree with what we did, but that they understand that we actually know that they exist, that we listen to them empathetically, that we haven't ignored them, that we're not elitists, that we're not suffering from hubris, that our job is to go out into the world and listen, and we need to do a really good job of that. And I do think that we need to always meet very high standards. And I do worry that some of the things that people do, particularly on social media, send the wrong signal about what we're all about. And I think it's important that we actually do everything in our power as journalists to enhance the reputation and strengthen the credibility and integrity of our institutions, and that we not just think of ourselves and our own individual brands, but that we think of the institutions that we represent. And I'm certainly not guaranteeing instant results, but I think over the long run, if we do that, if we approach our work in that way, if the journalism is done properly, it will stand up over time, and it will be validated, and that will be to our benefit.
To which I say, amen.
Well, amen. We're done, I think. Thank you. And we need to let Marty and David, I think, have lunch. Just want to thank you both so much for, some incredible contributions to journalism, for talking with us today, and for your support of the International Free Expression Project. Thank you to our partners at IFEX. And thank you to the Colcom Foundation for its financial support of this series of conversations. This is a series of conversations, so please stay tuned to our website, which is ifep.io, social media, and we'll probably be emailing you as well, just to let you know when we're going to have further discussions.